She thought she saw the horizon as a blur, without a border between land and sky, but both fading into each other, or rather a set background that crossed across where both would be. The sky was overcast, but there was something of a glow in an unidentifiable shade, maybe described as a tan, that seemed to suggest that it was not the sun but some other source of light. But as she walked towards it, she realised that what was once land was now ocean, that somehow the entirety of land between the parts of town she was in and the obscured horizon had been covered by some quiet, slow-moving tsunami. She did not hear the usual sound of waves or even wind. It was more an undulating, voiceless sigh, more akin to a sleeping person's breathing, and the entire vision before her as its source. Around her, she noticed the town blurred in this unidentifiable light, filtered as it was through cloud or fog or some kind of obstructive mist, so that the buildings, roads and other features all took on the same hue with little variation apart from shade and line. And she felt all this as a tangible something that was distinguished by the absence of what she was familiar with, the usual light and shade, sounds and odours, the usual feel of a normal day. She felt nothing to indicate a positive presence of anything, but some kind of blurring of senses into a one whole. Moreover, she felt in herself that she was moving more slowly than she normally would, a kind of numbness upon her limbs, and she also found mental recall somewhat difficult, as if she was tired from some narcotic. Of course she remembered that her name was Alicia, and that she was here in the town of Perceville on a kind of work holiday, gathering material for a new book. She was a writer by trade, but had only recently found success with the publication of her last novel, which had been set in a town much like this one. Any other memory, though, she found blurring, but this did not elicit the anxiety that she would normally associate with memory loss. She had an aunt who had died of dementia after what seemed like too many years of slow degeneracy, and recalled the old lady's sometimes frightened frustration at being unable to remember and do many basic things. Alicia had been as heartbroken as other family members watching her aunt slowly but inexorably go from a vital and active human being to a bedbound human vegetable. With dementia in the family, she was aware that she had a higher rate of contracting it herself, but now that she was experiencing blurred gaps in her memories, she felt no anxiety, just a gentle confusion. So she could not, at that time, distinguish between whether her own senses were betraying her or whether there really was something moving into the town of Perceville, this glowing light and nearly silent, slowly incoming ocean. Perhaps this was climate change. Although the town was some several miles from the nearest beach, this was definitely ocean, although quiet and odourless. But no seagulls yelling, no sign of debris of whichever civilization would have been between Perceville and the original beach, floating on its placid surface. Perhaps it wasn't climate change. What was happening was something outside Alicia's experience or memory of anything she had ever read or heard, a complete lack of any real information that could assist her in understanding what she was seeing and feeling and no longer feeling. She then saw, to her left, standing near a courtyard plinth, a woman standing very straight but not rigid. She was dressed in an almost period-piece dress, black or some dark colour, with a matching bonnet. She looked like she was in her 50s, thin but not austere, and she was reading a small book she held in her hands. She might have been there all this time, and it was only now Alicia noticed her. Alicia approached her, feeling the languid slowness in her body, and in approaching the woman she recognised her. No less a person than Melina Varlam, the literature teacher of her high school in Chelsea. Alicia went up close to her, who seemed to not notice Alicia, or anything outside of the book she was reading. "Mrs. Varlam," Alicia said, "I'm pleased to see you here. This is an odd coincidence." Melina raised her eyes from the book, but otherwise made no other movement. Her face seemed somewhat chalkier than Alicia remembered. "I'm sorry." "I'm Alicia Trown. I was in your literature class at St. Mark's, along with Wilhelmina and Bethany Close." After a brief pause, Melina replied, "Ah, yes, of course. Alicia. I remember now. Do excuse me, I retired a few years ago. I've been living here for a few years now. If I had known you would be in town, I'd have gladly received you at home. I have a small but lovely house near the public gardens." She sounded sincere, but her voice was flatter and less descriptive than Alicia recalled. Melina had been a well-respected and loved teacher, but she was also redoubtable in her moderated chastisement, which all the students learned to respect and avoid as much as possible. She had certainly been, Alicia was sure, more animated than this. The older woman didn't move, apart from her mouth and eyes. She stood as if she was a feature of the courtyard, and not a living human being. "Miss Farlam, excuse me asking this, but do you know what's happening?" There was another pause, and then Melina turned her face to consider the glowing, blurred spectacle of the near silent and slowly encroaching ocean. "That you mean? No, dear, I'm afraid I don't. I only noticed it, I think it was yesterday. I've been here for a while now." Did she mean here in this courtyard? Alicia was confused, without feeling anything much else emotionally. She briefly wondered at that too, but then also turned to stare. For a while both women stared in silence. "It's strange, don't you think?" Alicia finally said. "We're so far from the beach." "Yes, it isn't normal. I'm not sure what to make of it. I haven't heard of anything on the wireless. No one I know has mentioned it, in fact, but it must have been happening for a while now." They both looked. The soft, misted glow, the barely audible sound, none of it worried them. It seemed to Alicia, the more she considered it, that there was nothing unusual about it, that there was an inevitability about it. She saw that the edge of the water was somehow fading into the bitumen and concrete of the road and footpath, and that the very bricks and woods of the building seemed themselves to fade, as if blurring, into the edges of the light as it struck them, like a naturally occurring phenomena that was always going to happen. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. No real emotional response seemed necessary, and both women didn't feel any response other than basic interest and observation. Without saying anything, Alicia turned and walked back away from the encroaching horizon, down the broad avenue towards the hostel she was staying at. She moved slowly, like moving through a substance thicker than air, without feeling it. When she got to the door of her hostel, which was only a few doors away from the courtyard, she turned back and noticed Melina was absent. The haze had imposed slightly more into the courtyard, obscuring formerly stable features. Had it been that Melina had disappeared, as much as the rest of the world that had been occupied by this slightly glowing blur? Alicia wondered for the first time just how far across the country this phenomenon was spreading, or whether it was worldwide. Surely it had to be worldwide. If so, did that mean that there were entire nations now non-existent, with their whole populations? Was this some world-ending apocalypse she was witnessing and a part of? Maybe. But she found the idea of the world ending to be of less significance than her desire to find something to eat. Deciding on that, she went into the hostel. It was dark, darker than it should have been, and the darkness was, like the haze outside, something more tangible than mere absence of light, but something less tangible than substance. There was no qualitative difference in temperature or other sensations. She still felt a languorous numbness that did not restrict her actions, but gave them a benumbed quality befitting the current blurring of light and matter. She went behind the check-in desk because she knew there was a small pantry kept there. It was almost empty, but there was a loaf of some brown bread and a small clay jar with locally produced butter. She tore off a chunk of the bread and used the knife in the jar to apply the condiment. Just about to eat, she noticed Mrs. Vod, the proprietress of the establishment, standing in a dark nook, upright and unmoving, regarding her casually. Alicia felt no guilt in helping herself to Mrs. Vod's store of food. She went ahead to bite and chew, returning Mrs. Vod's nearly indifferent gaze. The two women stared at each other with little emotion as Alicia finished her lunch. In the hostel there was little ambient noise. There was a clock in the parlour, adjacent to the lobby hall, usually audible from the desk, but Alicia only barely noticed it had stopped for some reason. There was little else to hear. The simple staring continued for no other reason than there was little else to actually do at the time. Neither of them seemed to think of anything to say or any other action to take. An indifference was growing in both of them as the haze grew outside. Finally, perhaps more out of long-practiced etiquette than anything else, Mrs. Vod spoke. "There's little other food in the house, I'm afraid. Patat hasn't come this morning with anything, and I can't track her down. No one seems to be answering their phones at the moment." Alicia nodded. "And I was going to go to the market this morning, but I found the time just getting away from me." Alicia felt she understood more than was needed to explain. Time had gotten away from everyone, and, it seemed, everything. Time, it seemed, had become as redundant as everything else. "I don't know if the market's still there anymore, in any case," Alicia responded. In other circumstances that would have seemed an absurd thing to say, but at this Mrs. Vod merely affirmed. "Yes, by now I would expect. Everything on the other side of the courtyard, I'd say. Is it any closer?" "I think so," Alicia replied, then moved around from behind the desk to the front door. She put herself outside, one hand still on the door. Sure enough, the courtyard was even more consumed than before. She wasn't sure of the pace of the thing, but it was definitely coming closer. "Yes, Mrs. Vod. Nothing more there now. The courtyard should be gone soon. And the rest of the street soon, I expect," Mrs. Vod concluded. "It's coming this way," Alicia affirmed softly, leaning now on the door and watching the horizon shimmering hazily, blurring. Mrs. Vod was staring at nothing, still standing unmoving in the gloom of her hostel. Alicia could think of nothing else to do but stand where she was and watch the horizon, watch the slow dissolution of reality into a softly glowing haze, blurring distinctions between things into an undynamic, meaningless whole. With no emotion, one way or the other, just watch what was happening and what was always going to happen.